God, we give thanks for music and poetry and the ways they move us to see life, to see ourselves, to see our world a little bit differently. How they push us to listen and to learn and to appreciate the gifts of others. This morning, as we think through jazz and Jesus, we ask that you help us cross over, to not be afraid to create and to experiment and to embrace life in places that we might not often look. Amen. Miles Davis once said, "The history of jazz can be summed up in 4 words: Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker." And I'm not sure that Miles Davis is wrong. Charlie Parker might be the most accomplished alto saxophonist of all time. But what really set Parker apart from all the greats was his desire to set jazz free. Parker longed to recreate jazz, to demolish the harmonic restraints of jazz and push it to new heights. Parker was a restless soul who loved jazz almost more than anything else in life. And yet, the creative angst that raged inside him also led him to shatter jazz so that he could see what he could do with the pieces. And the reason that Parker did this is because he was bored. He was bored by the big orchestras like Ellington's that dominated his day. He was bored of the commercial jingles. He was bored of the stereotypical chords and bored that jazz musicians had to be performers. So he made it his goal to create performances that wasted no space at all and had absolutely no sentimental melodies. As a teenager, he practiced 15 hours every day for over 4 years straight. Dropped out of school just to do it. And he wanted to entertain people, not through the performance, but just through the music. Charlie Parker stormed on the scene when he was just 19 years old. And immediately his talent was recognized by the greats. But what shocked everyone more than his talent was how he refused to obey the rules of jazz. Parker grew up in the Wild West town of Kansas City, where everything was wide open and rules were set on their head. And this is exactly his approach that he took to jazz. Parker longed to transgress all the boundaries that were trying to contain jazz during his day. He was always looking for new jam partners, different influences which could expand his creativity. Often he combined his jazz with the classical artists, like Stravinsky. But this drive that he had to constantly deconstruct jazz, this quest to always push it further, it filled him with angst. Ultimately, this obsession seems to be what killed him. He could never find peace, never sit still. He died at just 34 years old, and honestly, his creativity had flamed out a few years earlier. Parker today is known as one of the founders of bebop jazz, when jazz became more for listeners and less for dancing, when smaller bands and longer solos became the standard. But what I think Miles Davis understood when he said that the history of jazz can be summed up with 4 words: Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, is that Parker set the trajectory for jazz that still continues to this day. And that is to make jazz a music that defies borders. To make jazz a music that always seeks to break free from all the conventions that has come before. And one of the ways that jazz has sought to live into Parker's vision over the years is this willingness for jazz to converse with almost every other genre of music. Miles Davis explored rock jazz and even funk jazz. Today we have classical jazz, punk jazz, hip-hop jazz, techno jazz, bluegrass jazz, and even jazz metal. I know absolutely nothing about a couple of those. Virginia Stone, she loved Latin jazz. When she passed on, I got some of her CDs, and over 50% of them were Latin jazz. Each of these fusions, though, they're an attempt to cross over, to transcend the boundaries of jazz by befriending unlikely partners. Each of them are an attempt at holy hybridity, to experiment with whatever there is at hand, to expand the circle, to listen, to learn from, and to use the gifts of others as a way of advocating for a more inclusive way of life. Each of them are an embodiment of Parker's restlessness, to keep jazz always on the move, trying new things, pushing boundaries, and taking new risks. Holy hybridity, crossing over, befriending new people, pushing against the conventional boundaries of their day. This, to me, is the movement of Jesus' life. And nowhere do we see this better than in the stories where Jesus and the disciples in Mark's gospel get in the boat and head over to the other side on the Sea of Galilee. Our passage in Mark 4, it's a transitional story in Mark's gospel. Up until this point, almost everything that has occurred has taken place in Galilee. Jesus began by calling a group of peasant fishermen to be his disciples. And after this, he goes up and down the shoreline, teaching about the reign of God. He uses images that resonate with the common people, like sowers and seeds and lamp and family. He explained that God's kingdom is a movement of resistance, where ordinary people take responsibility into their own hands. And the message, it began to electrify the crowds, we are told. Well, this type of his ministry, this teaching parables in Galilee, it has just ended. And now would be a perfect time, if Jesus was rational, to go out and display for the world what this kingdom looks like. But that's not what Jesus does. With all the crowds watching and waiting to see what Jesus is going to do next, instead of mobilizing all the people that are gathered, Jesus does the opposite. He leaves them all behind. He goes somewhere else. He tells the disciples to get into a boat, for we're going over to the other side. And that's not the words the disciples they wanted to hear. The Sea of Galilee, it's the barrier, with Jews on one side and Gentiles on the other. Jews were taught to stay on their side where they're safe, where they're among their own. The other side of the sea, that's where the unclean people lived. For all their lives, these fishermen, they've been told that there's no reason to ever get in your boats and go to the other side. This is likely the first time that they've ever left Judea. Surely the disciples are questioning, really? You want us to go where, Jesus? On the journey over, a great storm arises. And the details of the storm, they highlight the fears that the disciples are feeling. They help us visualize the internal state that is going on. We are told that they left in the evening, when it was dark. Darkness represents the state of their soul. They are journeying into the unknown, which makes them afraid. The wind and the waves, they personify their fears of destruction and the chaos that rage inside of them. Crossing over, it petrifies them. They are overwhelmed by the horrors of what they think exists on the other side. The disciples' reluctance, it is highlighted in their question. Do you not care if we drown? In other words, don't you know the dangers that exist over there? This is a risky endeavor. And how does Jesus respond? He says, why are you so afraid? Why have you no faith? The word afraid might be better translated as cowardly, which illuminates the comedy in this passage, right? Here we have a group of fishermen who are more afraid of the storm and being on the waters than Jesus. So Jesus pacifies the wind and calms the waves. He shows the disciples that there's no reason to be afraid of journeying into the unknown. Instead, they must see otherness as an opportunity. For this is what faith is. Faith is taking the risk of stepping out into the darkness, into the unknown, and finding that Jesus is right there beside of us. Faith is an invitation into a way of life that draws us out of ourselves and into communion with neighbors and strangers. Faith is finding the strength to cross over amid all of our doubts and our fears so that we can encounter and engage with those that our society often forgets. It's no coincidence that in Mark's gospel, the next few stories are all examples of Jesus transcending boundaries. After reaching Gentile territory, the disciples, they have to confront their fears head on again and again. First, they encounter a man that's living in the tombs possessed by demons. I'm sure this reinforced the disciples' belief that there's absolutely nothing good to see here. But Jesus doesn't see it that way. He liberates the man of his demons, and after that, Jesus helps a desperate, hemorrhaging Gentile woman. And then he touches and revives a young Gentile girl who was dead. These are all people who Jews were taught are unclean. And yet Jesus intermingles with them all. In all these encounters, Jesus is teaching the disciples one thing: how to cultivate the values and the virtues that are needed if we're going to engage with new cultures and peoples. He teaches them to receptively engage with those who are quite different from him. When we do this, creativity, growth, and reformation might occur, which enable us to perceive reality and ourselves more fully than before. It's interesting. The disciples, they never encounter a storm when they're going home in Mark's gospel, when they're returning back to their homeland. It's always easier being around people that are like us. It feels natural and safe. There is always an enhanced comfortability being around like-minded people. Difference, engaging others not like us, it is hard work. It's draining and it's fearful at times. And yet it is the work that Jesus calls us to do. For crossing over, learning and receiving from others, this is the way of God's peace. In Mark 6, a few chapters ahead, the disciples and Jesus, they cross over the same sea a second time. We know this story a little bit better. And the story, it reads like a test, where Jesus wants to learn what the disciples learned from their first trip. The text states that the disciples, they don't want to go. Jesus has to force them on the boat, and then Jesus makes them go by themselves. Jesus stays behind to see if the disciples are up for the challenge. Have they overcome their fears of crossing over and encountering the Gentiles? Are they open to the challenges of receiving others who see things differently than them? They're not. Again, night falls. The wind and the waves return. Mark literally states that they are tortured at their oars. They're not able to go anywhere. Jesus has to come to them. He has to walk on water and again calm the storm before they are able to continue their journey to the other side. Twice, Mark has the disciples cross over the Sea of Galilee and venture into Gentile territory. And both times they encounter a storm, which metaphorically articulates the difficulties that we have as humans with encountering difference. To learn how to vulnerably befriend those who are unlike us. We fear passing through boundaries because we are threatened by what we might find, by how we might be changed when we journey into different contexts with different people. We'd rather ignore otherness or destroy it instead of learning from it and being transformed. Louis Armstrong was not a fan of Charlie Parker or his contemporaries, not at all. He called their music a modern menace and not good at all. He thought they had set jazz back decades. And other specialists, they made a career out of insisting that bebop was not jazz. It is hard to push against the boundaries that we have created, the structures that make us feel safe. And yet it is undeniable some 80 years later that Parker was a key leader in starting a movement that pushed jazz to embrace holy hybridity, to converse with and work with all different types of music in hopes of building and promoting something new. Are we willing to cross over like modern jazz? Are we willing to get on the boat and travel away from our spaces, associations, and familiar bodies and instead see this world from different places and from others' eyes? For the peace of Jesus calls us to embody a new kind of dwelling, one where we walk more receptively in strange neighborhoods, one where our vision bends and broadens as our bodies experience the reverberations, the dreams, and the hopes, and even the frustrations of others who see life differently. One where we converse with almost anyone and then find ways to accept, to deny, or whatever we need to do to let their perspective change us and our lives. To extend Jesus' peace, we must do what Jesus did, to cross over and to carry the world and the lives of others into our depths. A few weeks ago, I compared Jesus to a jazz musician. And another way Jesus acted like a jazz musician was in the way that crossing over was just who he was. And nowhere do we see this more clearly than in Jesus' flesh. Jesus is the God-man, fully God, fully human. Jesus is the one who crossed over, who left his eternal place with God and instead humbled himself to embrace our human nature too. Jesus is the God who chose to see the world from our eyes, to walk receptively in our neighborhoods, and to create a bridge between God and man forever. The incarnation is the story of the God who came from a far country so that God could embrace our worlds and our lives into God's depths. And that's because Jesus is this holy hybridity. So it shouldn't surprise us that his life and his ministry was full of experiences where Jesus crossed over to smash down the walls that separate us. Jesus was always on the move, even before he was born, entering into hostile territories, from Nazareth to Bethlehem to Egypt and back again. On the cross and in his death, Jesus crossed over to the realm of the dead so that he could incorporate even death into God's being. And after the resurrection, God crosses back over into heaven in order to introduce heaven, our humanity, into heaven once and for all. In all this, Jesus shows us that reconciliation is about crossing over. It's about engaging difference so that the boundaries that separate us can be obliterated. Crossing over is how we help bring about the kingdom of God among us. It is how we work with God to continually create a new world within this one. It's how we act like jazz musicians, doing the work of fusion, bringing people together so that a more inclusive world might exist that makes space for everyone, even us.